The first man disappeared in the summer of 1891. The second vanished 3 weeks later. The third was never found at all. By autumn, nobody in our corner of Appalachian Mountains would speak openly about where they had gone. Not because they didn't know, but because they did. And sometimes knowledge is far more frightening than mystery. I was 24 years old that year, working as a surveyor in western North Carolina. My job took me into places most people never saw, deep valleys hidden between mountain ridges, forgotten trails swallowed by forest, and stretches of wilderness so old they felt untouched by time itself. I spent most of my life in those mountains. I knew their sounds, I knew their moods. I knew when a storm was coming hours before clouds appeared. I knew which streams held trout and which hollows held bears. But there was places even experienced mountain men avoided, places that appeared on no map, places whispered about rather than discussed, places where stories seemed older than the trees themselves. One of those places was called Black Reed Hollow. At least that's what settlers called it. The Cherokee had another name for it. Most refused to translate it. Those who did offered different answers every time. The deep place, the hidden water, the place below. No two explanations ever matched. That should have been my first warning. The disappearances began with a name called Thomas Hale. Thomas wasn't foolish. That fact mattered. People often assume bad things only happen to reckless men. The truth is much worse. Thomas was intelligent, careful, experienced. He had spent years trapping and exploring the mountains. If anyone knew how to survive the wilderness, it was him. Yet one morning he packed supplies, took his horse, and headed toward Black Reed Hollow. He never returned. Search parties looked for nearly 2 weeks. They found the horse, they found his rifle, they found his bag, but they never found Thomas. The discovery unsettled everyone. His belongings had been left beside a creek deep within the forest. Nothing appeared stolen, nothing appeared damaged. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks, no clues. Just a campsite abandoned in the middle of an ordinary day. As though Thomas had simply stood up and walked away from his own life. The second disappearance involved a man named Jacob Mercer. Unlike Thomas, Jacob left behind a reason, a journal. Most of it contained ordinary notes, weather observations, hunting records, trail descriptions. Then, near the end, the entries changed. At first, the differences seemed small. A sentence here, a sketch there, references to strange sounds near the creek, reports of seeing unusual markings carved into stone. Then the entries became stranger, much stranger. I saw the journal myself years later. One page contained only a single sentence written repeatedly from top to bottom. I saw the water move again and again and again, nearly 50 times. The handwriting grew worse with each repetition. By the bottom of the page, it looked almost frantic. The final entry was written 2 days before he vanished. Only 6 words. It knows I found the trail. Nobody ever discovered what trail he meant, or who, or what he believed was aware of him. Then Jacob disappeared too. After that, fear began spreading through the mountains, not panic, not hysteria, something quieter. The kind of fear people carry in silence, the kind that makes conversations stop when strangers approach, the kind that causes old men to stare into the fire instead of answering questions. I first heard about all this from my friend Samuel Brooks. We were sitting outside a general store one humid August evening when he brought it up. The sun was settling behind the mountains. Crickets filled the air. The world seemed perfectly ordinary. Samuel looked anything but ordinary. He seemed nervous, distracted, like a man debating whether he should stay or he should say something. Finally, he leaned closer. "You ever hear of UTKENA?" The name meant nothing to me. I shook my head. "No." His expression darkened. "My grandfather used to talk about it." I laughed. "Another mountain ghost story?" Samuel didn't laugh back. That should have been my second warning. He glanced around before speaking again. "Not a ghost." "What then?" For several moments he remained silent. Then he lowered his voice. "The Cherokee say it's older than the mountains." The answer sounded ridiculous. Older than the mountains? Nothing was older than the mountains. Yet something about the way he said it unsettled me. Not the words, the certainty. As if he wasn't repeating a story, as if he was repeating a warning. Samuel pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. He handed it to me. "What is this?" "Found it yesterday." I unfolded it. At first it looked like an ordinary sketch, then I noticed the details. The drawing showed a serpent, not a normal snake. Something enormous, horned, coiled around a mountain, its body disappearing in clouds. At the center of its forehead sat a strange diamond-shaped mark. The sketch had clearly been made in haste. Lines stretched aggressively across the paper. Whoever drew it had been more concerned with recording what they saw than making it look good. "Where'd you get this?" I asked. Samuel swallowed. His eyes never left the drawing. It was inside Jacob Mercer's journal. The evening suddenly felt less comfortable. I looked down again. The serpent's eye had been shaded darker than everything else. For reasons I couldn't explain, it felt less like a drawing and more like a memory. And a memory that didn't belong to me. Then I noticed writing beneath the image, only a few words, written in uneven handwriting, so faint they were almost invisible. I held the paper close and felt a chill despite the summer heat. The message said, "Don't follow the water after sunset." That night, for the first time in my life, I dreamed of a river I had never seen, and something moving beneath it. The dream returned the following night, and the night after that, always the same river, always the same feeling. I would find myself standing on a rocky bank beneath a sky I couldn't recognize. Fog drifted across black water so still it looked frozen. Yet I knew something beneath the surface was moving, not swimming, circling, waiting. Every dream ended the same way. The water would begin rising without a sound. The fog would part, and somewhere below the surface, a single enormous eye would open. Then I would wake, breathing hard, heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that the dream wasn't entirely mine. By the fourth night, I stopped telling myself it was coincidence, because dreams don't usually leave evidence behind. This one did. The morning after the fourth dream, I discovered mud on my boots. Fresh mud. Dark river mud. At first I assumed I'd forgotten where I'd been the previous day. Then I realized something. I hadn't gone near any river, not for nearly a week. Yet there it was, circling to the leather, the same dark color I remembered from the dream. I spent nearly an hour convincing myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. I never found one. 3 days later, I decided to speak with the last person in the county who might know something about Black Reed Hollow, an old Cherokee man named Ali Walking Bear. Most locals simply called him Mr. Ali. He lived alone in a cabin several miles outside town, deep among the hills. People respected him, not because he demanded respect, because he never seemed to need it. Even the loudest men lowered their voices around him. The journey took most of the afternoon. By the time I reached his property, clouds had gathered over the mountains. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. The old man was sitting on his porch when I arrived, as if he'd been expecting me. He watched me approach without speaking. His face revealed nothing, neither welcome nor suspicion, just patience. I removed my hat. "Mr. Ali," he nodded once. "You've been dreaming." The words stopped me cold. For a moment I simply stared, then I laughed nervously. How would he know that? His eyes remained fixed on me, because they all dream first. The smile disappeared from my face. A gust of wind moved through the trees. The old man motioned toward an empty chair. I sat. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I removed the folded sketch from my pocket. The drawing Samuel had shown me, the horned serpent, the strange mark on its forehead. The moment Mr. Ali saw it, something changed in his expression. Not fear, recognition. The kind of recognition a man has when he sees something he hoped never to see again. Where did he get this? Jacob Mercer's journal. The old man looked away toward the mountains. His jaw tightened. Then Jacob found more than he should have. The words lingered in the air. I leaned forward. "What is it?" He remained silent. The thunder sounded closer now. The wind carried the scent of rain. Finally, he spoke. "When I was a boy, my grandfather told stories about things that existed before people learned to ride." His voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone repeating something old, something important. Most of those stories were warnings. I listened carefully. The old man continued. "People heard the name UTKENA and would think of a monster." He shook his head. "That is the mistake." A strange unease settled in my chest. If it's not a monster, what is it? His eyes met mine. For the first time since arriving, I saw concern there, real concern. The question isn't what it is. A pause. The question is why it allows itself to be found. The answer made no sense, and somehow that made it worse. Rain began tapping against the porch roof, soft at first, then harder. The mountains darkened beneath gathering clouds. Mr. Ali leaned back in his chair. "My grandfather said there are places where the world is thinner than it should be." I thought of the dreams, the disappearances, the journal, the serpent drawing. For reasons I couldn't explain, everything suddenly felt connected. The old man continued. "Most people pass those places without noticing." Another pause. "But every generation, someone sees things." The rain intensified. Water streamed from the roof's edge. The woods beyond the porch disappeared behind a curtain of gray. "What happens to them?" I asked. His answer came immediately. "They become curious." A chill ran through me because he was right. That was exactly what I had become. Not frightened, not skeptical, curious. The old man saw the realization in my eyes, and he didn't seem pleased. Thomas Hale became curious. The rain hammered the roof now. Jacob Mercer became curious. Thunder rolled across the mountains. Then Mr. Ali spoke the sentence that would follow me for the rest of my life. "Curiosity is how the trail begins." The word settled heavily between us. I looked down at the serpent sketch again, the horn, the eye, the strange diamond shape on its forehead. and suddenly I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A second drawing hidden beneath the first, almost invisible. A faint outline scratched into the paper. A map, a crude map leading toward Black Reed Hollow. At its center sat a single symbol, a circle. Inside the circle were three words written so lightly they nearly vanished into the page. Yet the moment I read them, I wish I hadn't. The water remembers names. I should have burned the map. Looking back now, that would have been the sensible thing, a wise thing, the sort of decision old men make after surviving long enough to recognize danger. But I was 24, and curiosity has ruined far more lives than fear ever has. For the next week, I carried the map everywhere, folded in my coat pocket, hidden from everyone, even Samuel, especially Samuel, because once I discovered the faint trail markings scratched into the page, I couldn't stop studying them. The route wound through portions of the mountains I knew well, and I entered territory I didn't. Not because the land was unexplored, because nobody seemed interested in discussing it. Every trail ended at the same place, Black Reed Hollow. The deeper I looked, the stranger the map became. Distances didn't seem correct. Ridges appeared where none should exist. Creeks bent in impossible directions. Entire sections appeared deliberately erased, as if whoever created it wanted the destination found, but not easily. One evening, I spread the map across my kitchen table and began comparing it to my survey records. Hours passed. Outside, darkness settled over the mountains. A lantern burned beside me. The room remained silent except for the scratching of my pencil. Then I noticed something. One of the creeks marked on the map didn't exist, at least not officially. I checked every survey chart I owned. Nothing. No record, no mention, no name. Yet the hand-drawn map clearly showed a narrow waterway feeding into Black Reed Hollow from the north, a forgotten tributary, or something hidden. The realization should have excited me. Instead, it unsettled me, because I remembered Jacob Mercer's final entry. It knows I found the trail, not a trail, the trail, as though there was only one, and now I might be looking directly at it. That night, the dream changed. For the first time, I wasn't standing beside the river, I was walking along it. The water moved silently through dense fog. Trees leaned over the banks, their branches twisted together overhead, blocking the sky. The deeper I walked, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, no wind, only the soundless flow of black water. Then I noticed footprints, human footprints, fresh, pressed into wet mud beside the river. I followed them. One set, then two, then three. The tracks belonged to different people, different boots, different sizes, yet all moved in the same direction, upstream, toward something. The fog thickened, the river widened, and ahead I saw figures. 3 men standing near the water's edge, their backs turned toward me, motionless, waiting. I tried calling out. No sound emerged. One of them slowly turned. It was Thomas Hale. The second was Jacob Mercer. The third man didn't have a face. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. The dream remained vivid, too vivid.
I sat on the edge of my bed trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard something. Water. For a moment, I thought it was rain. Then I realized the sky outside was clear. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath the cabin, a slow trickling, like a creek running under the floorboards. I grabbed my lantern. The noise stopped immediately. Silence returned. I checked every room. Nothing. No leak, no standing water, no explanation. Yet when I stepped back into my bedroom, I found something lying on the floor beside the bed. A feather. Dark, glossy, nearly black. I picked it up. It wasn't from any bird I recognized. The shaft felt strangely heavy, almost like bone. I stared at it for several seconds, then threw it on the fire. The feather burned instantly, too quickly. A brief green flame flashed inside the stove before vanishing. I didn't sleep again. The next afternoon, I rode back to see Mr. Ali. This time, he didn't look surprised when I arrived. In fact, he seemed disappointed, as though my return confirmed something he already feared. You found the map. It wasn't a question. I nodded. The old man closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked exhausted. Tell me about the dreams. So I did. Every detail, the river, the footprints, the three figures, the faceless man, the strange sound beneath my cabin, the feather. When I finished, neither of us spoke. The wind moved softly through the trees around his porch. Somewhere far away, a crow called. Mr. Ali stared down the mountains, then finally said, "It has noticed you." A knot formed in my stomach. What has? His answer came quietly. The trail. The words made no sense, yet somehow they frightened me more than if he'd simply said UTKENA. The trail can't notice anyone. No. His eyes remained fixed on the distant ridges. It can't. A long pause followed, then he looked directly at me. But something at the end of it can. The afternoon suddenly felt colder. I reached into my coat and removed the map. The old paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from wind, from me. What exactly is fading in Black Reed Hollow? Mr. Ali studied the map for several moments. Then he said something that would haunt me long after the mountains themselves were gone from my life. My grandfather used to say there are creatures that God places. He paused. There are creatures that God triggers. Another pause. Then, and there are creatures that God secrets. The old man's voice lowered, almost to whisper. UTKENA, gods, all three. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The forest around the cabin seemed unusually quiet. Then I noticed something. Mr. Ali had never once described UTKENA as a serpent, not once. And suddenly I wasn't sure that was an accident. As I prepared to leave, he called out one final warning. I still remember every word, because they were the last words anyone spoke to me before I began searching for Black Reed Hollow. The men who disappeared made the same mistake. I turned. What mistake? The old man looked toward the mountains again, his expressions unreadable. Then he answered, they believed the danger was finding UTKENA. A chill moved through me because I already knew there was more, and sure enough, he finished the sentence. They never considered that UTKENA might be the thing looking for them.
I left Mr. Ali's cabin before sunset, not because I wanted to, because I knew if I stayed any longer, he would eventually convince me not to go. And by then, it was already too late. The truth is, I had crossed the line days earlier, not physically. The moment I started studying the map, Black Reed Hollow stopped being a place. It became an answer. And answers have a strange way of pulling people toward them. The mountains were painted gold by the setting sun as I rode home. Normally, that sight brought me comfort. That evening, it felt like a warning. Every ridge seemed taller, every shadow seemed deeper. The wilderness no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, as though something ancient was watching from behind the landscape itself. That night, I packed supplies, enough food for several days, a rifle, a lantern, survey equipment, extra ammunition, a compass, and Jacob Mercer's map. I told nobody where I was going, not Samuel, not my neighbors, nobody, because deep down, I already suspected what they would say. Don't go. Forget the hollow. Leave the mountains alone. Yet every missing man had heard the same warnings, and every missing man had ignored them. I realize now that should have mattered more, but curiosity is a difficult thing to reason with, especially when it begins feeling less like curiosity and more like density. I left before dawn. Fog hung low across the valleys. The world appeared soft and gray beneath the morning light. For the first few hours, the journey followed familiar trails, old logging roads, hunter paths, creek crossings I'd traveled dozens of times before. Nothing unusual, nothing frightening. The map seemed almost unnecessary. Then, shortly after noon, the trail ended, not gradually, abruptly. One moment I was following a clear route through the forest. The next, I stood facing untouched wilderness. No path, no markings, nothing. The woods beyond looked older somehow, the trees thicker, the shadows darker. Even the air felt different, still, heavy, like stepping inside a church. I checked the map. According to the drawing, the hidden creek should be somewhere nearby. I spent nearly an hour searching. Nothing. No water, no trail, no sign that anyone had ever passed through this section of forest. Eventually, frustration began replacing caution. I unfolded the map again, studied every line, every mark. Then I noticed something strange. The map wasn't oriented north. Every surveyor learns to check that first, yet somehow I'd overlooked it. The drawing had been created from another perspective entirely, one I couldn't identify. I rotated the paper once, twice, then again, and suddenly the landscape around me changed, not physically, mentally. Features I'd overlooked began aligning with the drawing. A cluster of boulders, a fallen pine, a narrow ridge. The map wasn't inaccurate. I'd simply been reading it wrong. The realization sent a chill through me because whoever created it had done so deliberately. The map didn't want to be understood quickly. It wanted to be earned. I followed the new direction. Less than 20 minutes later, I found the creek and immediately wished I hadn't. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a narrow ribbon of water cutting through the forest. Dark, slow-moving, quiet. Then I noticed the silence. No birds sang nearby, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed unwilling to touch the place. The creek moved through absolute stillness, the sort of stillness that belongs underground. I knelt beside the water. The surface reflected the trees perfectly, too perfectly, like black glass. I reached toward it, then stopped, because I remembered the dream, the river, the eye beneath the surface, the feeling of being watched. For several moments, I remained frozen, listening, nothing. Eventually, I laughed at myself, a nervous laugh, the kind people use when trying to prove they aren't afraid. Then I dipped my fingers into the creek. The water was warm. I pulled my hand back instantly. Warm. Not cool. Not cold. Warm. Despite flowing from deep mountain wilderness, despite the fact that every other stream in the region ran cold year around, I touched it again, the same result. Warm as blood. A knot formed in my stomach. For reasons I couldn't explain, the warmth felt wrong, not unnatural, personal. As though the creek wasn't carrying water, as though it was carrying memory. I stood quickly. The forest suddenly felt smaller, closer. My eyes moved through the trees, searching, expecting, nothing. Yet the sensation remained, the certainty that something had noticed me. Hours passed as I followed the creek deeper into the mountains. The terrain grew rougher, steeper, more isolated. The trees blocked much of the sunlight now. The world beneath them existed in permanent twilight. Several times I found markings carved into stone, symbols, ancient ones. Some resembled serpents, others looked like spirals. A few had been deliberately scratched out, as though someone wanted them erased. Near sunset, I discovered the first proof that I wasn't alone. At the edge of a muddy bank beside the creek, a footprint, fresh. I crouched immediately, studied it carefully. The print belonged to a boot, human, modern, not old, not weathered, recent, very recent. My pulse quickened. Someone else had been here, perhaps only hours before, perhaps less. I followed the tracks for nearly 50 yards, then they stopped. Not faded, stopped. The final footprint ended beside the creek. After that, nothing. No return trail, no signs of departure, no evidence whatsoever, only water. I stared at the muddy bank for several seconds, then several more. The conclusion felt impossible, yet every alternative felt worse. The person hadn't walked away, the creek had taken them. As darkness settled over the mountains, I made camp on a small rise overlooking the water. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, tried convincing myself there was a reasonable explanation for everything I'd seen. The warm creek, the symbols, the vanished tracks, the silence. None came. Night arrived fully. The forest disappeared beyond the reach of firelight, and somewhere around midnight, I woke to a sound. Not loud, not sudden, a whisper. I sat upright immediately. The fire had burned low. The woods remained dark and silent. For several moments, I heard nothing. Then the whisper came again, this time from across the creek. A man's voice. Faint, distant, speaking words I couldn't understand. I grabbed my lantern, raised it toward the opposite bank. The whispering stopped instantly. The light revealed only trees, fog, dark water, nothing else. Then movement caught my eye. Far beyond the lantern's glow, a figure standing among the trees, motionless, watching.
My heart began hammering. The distance made details impossible, yet one thing was clear. The figure was unusually tall, far taller than any man. I stared, the figure stared back. Neither of us moved. Then the fog shifted, only for a second, but it was enough, long enough for me to realize something terrible. It wasn't standing beside a tree. What I thought was a tree was part of it, and whatever I was looking at had been there long before I arrived. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night, not after seeing the figure across the creek, not after realizing it wasn't standing beside the tree, because once that thought entered my mind, I couldn't remove it. The thing I'd mistaken for a tree trunk had curved, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Enough to suggest shape, enough to suggest life, enough to make me understand that some things are so large your mind refuses to recognize them immediately. The fire burned low beside me. I fed it more wood, then more. Yet I never took my eyes off the opposite bank. The fog drifted constantly, sometimes revealing shapes, sometimes hiding them, sometimes I convinced myself the figure was gone. Then the mist would shift again, and there it was, exactly where it had been before, watching, waiting. Toward dawn, exhaustion finally began dulling my fear, and that's when the whispering returned. This time it came from the creek itself, not the forest, not the darkness, the water. The sound was faint, barely audible, like voices heard through a wall. I moved closer to the bank. The whispering grew louder, still impossible to understand, yet strangely familiar. I knelt beside the water. The surface remained perfectly smooth, black as polished stone. Then I heard a word, my name. I froze. The voice was unmistakable. Someone had spoken my name. Directly beneath the water, a wave of cold rushed through my body. I stood so quickly I nearly fell. The whispering stopped immediately. The creek returned to silence. For several moments I simply stared, listening, waiting. Nothing. The sun finally rose. Gray light filtered through the trees. The fog began thinning, and with daylight came confidence. That false confidence morning often provides after a terrifying night. I convinced myself fatigue had caused it. The figure, the whispering, the voice, all of it, just exhaustion. That's what I told myself. Then I crossed the creek. The opposite bank proved difficult to reach. The water was deeper than expected, warm even in the early morning cold. The sensation disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. When I finally climbed onto the far side, I immediately searched for tracks, anything, some sign of what I'd seen. At first I found nothing, then I noticed the ground, or rather, the lake of it. The enormous pine tree I thought the figure had stood beside wasn't growing from the earth. It was growing from a mound, a massive mound, covered in moss, covered in roots, covered in decades of fallen leaves. From a distance it appeared natural. Up close it looked deliberate. The shape stretched through the forest for nearly 30 yards, too long, too smooth, too symmetrical. My stomach tightened, because suddenly the mound reminded me of something. A coil, a gigantic coil. I stood motionless, looking at it, trying not to think what my imagination was suggesting. Then I noticed the stone, half buried beneath roots, covered in carvings. I brushed away dirt and immediately wished I hadn't. The symbols matched those I had seen beside the creek: spirals, serpents, ancient markings worn smooth by time. But one carving stood apart from the others: a single eye, diamond shaped, exactly like the mark on the forehead in Jacob Mercer's drawing. The same symbol, the same shape, the same impossible detail. My pulse quickened. I examined the stone more carefully, and that's when I found the scratches. Human scratches, words carved by a knife, recent words. The letters were rough, uneven, made by shaking hands, yet still readable. I recognized the handwriting instantly: Jacob Mercer. I'd seen enough pages from his journal to know the message contained only one sentence, one horrifying sentence: "It isn't sleeping." A chill spread through my chest. I stepped back from the stone and nearly tripped over something hidden beneath the leaves: a rusted lantern, old, damaged, but recognizable. Nearby lay the remains of a bedroll, then a cooking pot, then a broken rifle stock, pieces of a campsite, a very old campsite. I stared at the items, slowly understanding someone had camped here years ago, perhaps decades, and never returned to collect their belongings. Then I noticed something else. Another lantern, farther away, another bedroll, another rusted tool. Not one campsite, several, scattered throughout the woods. The remains of different expeditions, different years, different people, all ending in the same place. The realization hit me with terrifying clarity. This wasn't where Thomas Hale disappeared or Jacob Mercer. This was where people had been disappearing for generations. The mountain had been keeping the secret long before anyone alive was born. I suddenly felt exposed, visible, as if every moment spent studying the area had been observed. The forest seemed different now. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. I turned toward the creek, ready to leave, ready to put distance between myself and whatever this place truly was. Then movement caught my eye. Across the water, on the bank where I'd camped, a man stood beside my extinguished fire, tall, motionless, watching me. For one brief moment, relief flooded through me. Another explorer, a hunter, something real. Then the figure stepped forward, and sunlight struck its face. My relief vanished, because I recognized him instantly: Thomas Hale, the first man who disappeared, the man who had vanished months earlier, the man everyone believed was dead. He stood silently across the creek. His clothes hung loose from his body, his skin appeared pale, almost gray, and although his eyes were fixed directly on me, there was absolutely no recognition in them. Then, very slowly, Thomas raised one hand, not waving, not signaling, pointing towards something behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed not to, but I did, slowly, reluctantly. And what I saw on the forest floor behind me made every ounce of blood leave my body. The leaves were moving, not from wind, not from animals. The ground itself was shifting, as though something enormous beneath the earth had just begun to breathe. The ground moved again, not like an earthquake, not like wind beneath roots, something slower, intentional, as if the forest itself had begun remembering how to breathe. I took a step back without thinking, then another. My eyes stayed fixed on the shifting leaves, on the soil beneath them, on the impossible suggestion that something enormous lay just under the surface. Across the creek, Thomas Hale still stood watching me, unmoving, unblinking, as if waiting for my reaction, as if this moment had already happened before. The forest around him remained still, too still. Even the fog seemed reluctant to pass through that space. Then Thomas, lowering his pointing hand, and stepped backward into the trees, not walking away, not fleeing, just receding, like something pulling him out of sight from the inside of the world itself. I shouted. I don't even remember what I said. His name, a warning, maybe both, but he didn't react. He simply disappeared between the trunks and the forest closed behind him. No sound followed, no rustle, no breaking branches, nothing, only silence. Across the creek, the fire I had built earlier still smoldered, weak embers glowing like dying eyes. I turned back toward the ground behind me. The movement had stopped, but the feeling remained. Something had been there, or something still was, waiting just beneath what I could see. I forced myself to breathe, slowly, carefully, trying to think like a surveyor again, trying to reduce fear into logic, into measurements, into something I could control. It didn't work, because logic does not explain soil that breathes. I knelt slowly, pressed my hand against the ground. Cold, solid, normal, yet I could feel it, a faint vibration deep below, not random, rhythmic, like a pulse. My hand jerked away instinctively. I stood immediately, and that's when I saw it. A thin crack in the earth, barely visible, running between the roots of the trees. It stretched in a curved line, too smooth to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. I followed it with my eyes. It didn't branch, it didn't break. It continued deeper into the forest, as if marking something buried beneath the entire ridge. A path no human had carved, but something far larger had. A path that had been here long before the trees grew over it. My throat tightened because suddenly I understood what Mr. Ali had meant. There are places where the world is thinner than it should be. This wasn't just a place, it was a boundary, and something on the other side was pressing against it, waiting. The wind picked up slightly, the fog shifted, and for a fraction of a second I thought I heard movement inside the earth itself, not digging, not crawling, turning slowly, as if something enormous had just become aware and was being observed. Across the creek, my abandoned campsite suddenly felt far away, unreachable, like it belonged to another life, another version of me. Then the whisper returned, not from the water this time, not from the trees, from everywhere at once, soft, patient, familiar. You followed the trail. My blood ran cold. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The voice continued. You brought yourself closer. The ground beneath me trembled faintly, not violently, almost like laughter held beneath stone. I stepped backward, slowly, carefully, each movement deliberate. The voice followed without moving. You were never searching for us. A pause. You were answering us.
The realization hit harder than fear because it wasn't wrong. It had followed every clue, every dream, every map, every warning, every disappearance. I had done exactly what something had intended. The creek behind me began to ripple, even though there was no wind, no current change. The surface distorted, like something beneath it had shifted position. The reflection in the water no longer matched the trees above it. It showed something else, something longer, something curved, something coiled. My breath caught. The water began to rise, just slightly, not flooding, not spilling, rising, as if drawn upward toward the surface by something pressing from below. The whisper returned again, closer now, not louder, closer. You are standing above us. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned toward the forest. The path behind me was gone, not blocked, not hidden, gone. The trees had rearranged themselves in my perception, or I had moved somewhere else without realizing. The direction I had come from no longer existed in a way I could recognize. I was no longer on a trail. I was on something that looked like a trail, but wasn't meant for leaving, only for arriving. The creek water suddenly stilled, utterly, perfectly, and in that silence, I saw it, just beneath the surface, not fully formed, not fully visible, a shape that made the water look too small to contain it, long, endless, coiling beneath the creek bed itself. And for the first time since I began this journey, I understood the true meaning of the name I had been repeating in my mind. UTKENA was not something I was approaching. It was something that had already wrapped itself around where I stood. The moment I realized it was beneath me, the forest changed. Not physically, not in any way that I could imaginally or immediately prove, but in the way our instincts recognize when something has stopped pretending. The creek stopped feeling like water. It felt like a surface, a thin lining separating what I could understand and what I was standing on top of. I stepped backward slowly, one step, then another, careful not to break whatever balance I suddenly felt I was part of. But the voice followed without sound, not from the water anymore, not from the trees, from everywhere the ground touched my boots. You see it now. My throat went dry. I didn't answer. I couldn't trust my voice, my own voice. Across the creek, Thomas Hale was still there, or what remained of him. His body didn't move, but his presence felt heavier than before, as if even he was no longer fully him. The water beneath him shifted slowly, almost respectful, like something recognizing its own memory. Then Thomas turned his head slightly, not toward me, toward the forest behind me, and for the first time I understood. He wasn't warning me. He was watching the same thing I was standing on, and a low vibration passed through the earth, subtle but undeniable, not shaking, breathing. The ground beneath my feet rose and fell just enough to make me question whether I was imagining it. But I wasn't, because the creek answered it. Ripples spread outward without wind, without impact, like something deep below had just adjusted its position. The voice returned again, calm, patient, closer than before. You are not above us. A pause. You are on us. My stomach tightened so violently I almost stumbled. I forced myself to look at the creek again. The water had darkened, not with dirt, not with shadow, with depth, too much depth. I forced myself to look at the creek again. The water had darkened, not with dirt, not with shadow, with depth, too much depth, as if the world under it had suddenly become larger than the world above it could contain. And then I saw it clearly, not the creature, not yet, but the suggestion of it. A curve beneath the surface that didn't match the shape of any riverbed, too smooth, too deliberate, too vast. It moved slowly, not swimming, turning, and every movement felt like it was happening miles below me and directly beneath my feet at the same time. The realization hit like a collapse in my chest. Black Reed Hollow was in the place leading to UTKENA. Black Reed Hollow was part of it. The map, the trail, the disappearances. They weren't journeys into the wilderness. They were steps along something already alive. Across the creek, Thomas Hale finally spoke. His voice was broken, not loud, not clear, but enough to reach me through the fog. Don't run. I stared at him. He didn't look afraid. He looked resigned, like a man remembering something too late. The water around him rose slightly, just enough to touch his boots, then his ankles, then his legs, not dragging him down, not pulling, accepting him as if he had always belonged there. My breath hitched. "Thomas," I shouted, but he didn't react. Instead, he slowly looked at me one last time, and I saw it then. Not possession, not death, understanding. He knew exactly what this was, and that was worse than anything else I had seen so far. The water reached his waist, then his chest. Still no struggle, no panic, just acceptance. The voice spoke again, this time softer, almost satisfied. Every trail has its return. I felt something behind me shift, not movement in the forest, movement and intention. Like the space I was standing in had just decided I was no longer optional. The ground beneath me pulsed once, slowly, heavy, like a heartbeat too large for the earth to contain. And for the first time since I arrived at the creek, I understood the true terror of UTKENA. It wasn't hunting, it wasn't waiting, it was already complete, and I was standing on one of its breaths. The realization didn't come like a thought, it came like pressure, as if something inside my mind had finally aligned with something far too large for it to contain. We were not standing near UTKENA, we were not being watched by UTKENA, we were inside its presence. Every breath I took suddenly felt borrowed. The air no longer belonged to the forest. It belonged to something deeper, something older, something that did not recognize me as separate from the ground I stood on. Across the creek, Thomas Hale was almost fully submerged now. The water reached his shoulders, his head tilted slightly upward, not toward survival, but toward acceptance. And then I saw it clearly. His lips moved, not a scream, not prayer, a single word. I couldn't hear it, but I understood it anyway, because the forest itself reacted. The water around him darkened, not violently, reverently, like the earth was acknowledging a return. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my body didn't listen. It felt wrong to move, like movement itself would be noticed. Behind me, the forest no longer felt like an escape route. It felt like a surface stretched over something infinite. And then the voice returned, not from outside this time, inside the space between my thoughts. "You are already part of the path." I staggered backward, one step, then stopped immediately. The ground beneath my boot didn't feel solid anymore.
It felt responsive, like it had accepted the pressure of my weight. The creek shifted again, but not like water, like muscle adjusting under skin. That was the moment I understood the truth I had been circling since the map. HORNED was not in the hollow. HORNED was the hollow. The land, the water, the silence between trees, everything was simply expression of something living beneath understanding. Across the creek, Thomas Hale's head slipped beneath the surface. No struggle, no final breath, just disappearance. And yet, there was no sense of death, only transition, as if he had stepped from one state of being into another that had always been waiting. The water stilled perfectly, like a surface returning to order after acknowledging completion. My throat tightened. "Thomas," I whispered, but even his name felt uncertain now, like it belonged to a version of reality that was already loosening. The creek reflected the forest again, but not correctly. The reflection lagged, then changed. For a fraction of a second, I saw something beneath it, a curvature so vast my mind refused to interpret it as shape. It was not a creature moving underwater, it was water moving around something that could not be contained by definition. The forest behind me went silent, not quiet, erased. Even the wind stopped attempting to pass through it. And then I felt it, a shift beneath the ground, slow, deliberate, like something turning its attention without moving its body. The voice spoke one final time, calm, certain, not threatening, confirming. "You followed the trail." A pause. "And now the trail follows you." The creek began to ripple again, not outward, upward, as if something below was rising without changing position. I took a step back, then another, but the forest behind me was no longer aligned with where I had come from. It had folded, subtly, imperceptibly, until direction no longer meant escape, only continuation. The water rose slightly above the bank, not spilling, not flooding, reaching, and in that reaching, I finally saw what UTKENA truly was. Not a serpent, not a guardian, not even a creature in any sense my mind could safely hold. It was a path that never ended, and everything that entered it simply became part of its direction. The realization should have broken me, but instead it quieted something inside me, because now I understood why no one ever returned from Black Reed Hollow, not because they were taken, but because there was nowhere left to return to. And as the water rose one final inch, I felt the ground beneath me begin to move, not away, not toward, but onward. The ground moved again, but this time I didn't think of it as movement. I thought of it as continuation, like something that had already been happening long before I arrived, simply reaching the part where I could no longer ignore it. The creek was no longer a boundary, it was a surface tension, a thin, fragile agreement between what I believed the world was and what it actually was beneath that belief. I stepped back instinctively, but there was nowhere to step to. The forest behind me didn't feel like escape anymore. It felt like another layer of the same thing, a continuation of the same body. The voice returned, softer now, not inside my head, not outside it, everywhere at once. "You are not at the end." A pause. "You are at the joining." The water rose again, slowly, not like flood water, like awareness. Across the creek there was nothing left of Thomas Hale. No body, no struggle, no trace, only stillness. as if he had never been separated from the place at all. And that thought, that terrible, quiet thought, settled into me with final certainty. No one was taken by UTKENA. They were absorbed into its continuity. The shape beneath the creek shifted once more, and for the first time I understood why it was called a serpent. Not because of form, but because of function. It moved the way knowledge moves, forward, without return. The forest behind me began to feel thinner, not safer, not clearer, just less distinct, as if the world was losing the need to define where I ended and it began. The ground beneath my boots softened slightly, not collapsing, not sinking, adjusting, accepting. And I realized something I wish I had never understood. There was no confrontation coming, no escape, no moment of victory or survival, because UTKENA was never waiting for a fight, it was waiting for completion. The creek's surface went perfectly still again, a mirror, and in that mirror I saw it, not as a creature, but as a vast curvature beneath all visible reality, coiling through river, stone, forest, and memory itself, not moving toward me, not moving away, simply continuing.
The voice returned one last time, not a warning, not a threat, a conclusion. You were always part of the path. The forest faded at the edges of my sight, not disappearing, receding, like something no longer needed for the next stage. My thoughts began to loosen, names became distant, memories softened, even fear lost its structure, and in its place, something quieter arrived. Understanding, not peace, not horror, something older than both. I looked once more at the creek, at the place where Thomas Hale had stood, at the place where Jacob Mercer had searched, at the place where I had arrived thinking I was investigating something outside myself. And I finally understood the truth they never wrote in journals, never carved into stone, never warned about, aloud in full daylight. UTKENA was not discovered, it was entered, and once entered, there was no direction left that was not part of it. The water rose one final time, not consuming, not attacking, becoming. And as it touched the bank where I stood, I no longer felt like I was standing anywhere at all, only moving endlessly along a path that had no beginning and would never require an end.